However, we are waiting for one more speaker. He is now connecting with the system. Now we have arranged 4 speakers of today, and as you may know, tomorrow we also have another meeting, online meeting, just only SEAFDEC and member countries, in order to discuss what is the way forward for our Southeast Asian countries to go ahead on the issues of WTO negotiation on fishery subsidy. May I proceed to the schedule? So far we have about 70 participants, including 5 panelists with us now. I would like, first of all, invite our Secretary General, Madam Malini Smith-Ritty, to give her opening remarks. Our Secretary General, please.
Thank you, Dr. Warovit. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the SEAFDEC webinar on fishery subsidies, the Southeast Asian region perspective. We are all aware that members of the WTO are currently negotiating new multilateral disciplines to tackle the harmful fisheries subsidies that undermine sustainable utilization of marine resources. Such disciplines include the negotiation on subsidies that contribute to IUU fishing, subsidies to the fishing of overstock, and subsidies that contribute to overcapacity and overfishing. At the WTO Ministerial Conference in 2005, the members agreed to prohibit certain forms of fishery subsidies that contribute to overcapacity and overfishing. 10 years later, UN Sustainable Development Goals also look for the prohibition and elimination of subsidies that contribute to IUU fishing. Taking into account the importance of fisheries for priorities development, poverty alleviation, livelihood, and food security, they agree that appropriate and effective special and differential treatment for developing countries and least developed countries should be an integral part of the negotiation. After a series of meetings and negotiations, new proposals are tabled by different proponents in the WTO Ministerial Conference in 2017. However, members of the WTO failed to reach an agreement for streamlining the negotiation text. Instead, the minister assigned to continue negotiation based on emerging consolidated text and set a deadline for the conclusion of the talks in Ministerial Conference in 2019. Now, COVID-19 pandemic forced the member of the WTO to postpone the Ministerial Conference to 2021, and that creates further uncertainty on when the negotiations would be concluded. SEAFDEC therefore conduct this webinar to create a platform where representatives from WTO, FAO, International Institute of Sustainable Development, and Fisheries Agency of Japan can share experiences on fisheries subsidies to enable us to update the progress on the negotiations of fisheries subsidies. The information sharing would take place today. In this regard, I would like to encourage representatives from ASEAN SEAFDEC member countries to pay close attention on the presentation so that we will have a fruitful discussion tomorrow on the preparation of the WTO negotiations and way forward for our region. I would like to explain my sincere thanks to our speakers for joining this webinar and sharing your insights on the issues on fishery subsidies. Ladies and gentlemen, I believe that the information from our speakers will benefit us to update our knowledge on this issue. I extend my best wishes for the great success of this webinar. Thank you very much.
Yes, thank you very much, Madam Secretary General. So I would like to proceed further, but before that, I would like to show you an elaborate a bit what is our objective and what arrangement of today and tomorrow session will be. All attendees, you can observe that we have not only, you can see on the screen our objective, and you can have the video display on our resource speakers, and we also include a representative of the countries as a panel group, because under arrangement of 100 people in the room, it's not easy to trace them. That's why I put one representative of ASEAN member states into our small room in the panelist as a panelist. For your information, day one, we're providing you update information on negotiation agenda on fishery subsidy, where you can see we have a number of resource speakers here. We have representative from IISD, Madam Alice, and we have Sir Marcio from FAO headquarters. We have representative from Japan, Fisheries Agency, and we also have one more. He's still connecting into system. Hopefully he can make it, Mr. John from WTO. For today, it will be a bit discussion in overview, and some specific focus will be given to the ASEAN member states in order to prepare in the process of finalizing the text of fishery subsidy under the WTO negotiation. So this is the arrangement of our webinar today and tomorrow. For today, unfortunately, our colleague from the WTO has yet complete his connection to our system. We may proceed further with FAO headquarters. The title of his presentation is International Fish Trade and the main FAO instruments in support of the WTO negotiation on fishery subsidy. After his presentation, will be the presentation to be made by IISD, the practical steps that the WTO members, especially developing states in Southeast Asia, could consider to implement fishery subsidy reform. Last but not least, by the end of the day, we will have one more presentation from country representative of Japan, the national views on the WTO negotiation on fishery subsidy. So I was informed that we have already Mr. John online with us. Can you open your microphone and start your presentation if you are ready? Oh, okay, maybe he just connected. Maybe can we go to the second speaker first? Sir Marcio, are you okay? If we, okay, oh, sorry. We have him. Hello, John. How are you? I think we let him familiar with the system for a while, and then I think can we go to first, Marcio, for your presentation. The first one is on the FAO, the main instruments from FAO to support the implementation of this WTO negotiation process. Thank you, Marcio. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Brad. Thank you, Madam Secretary General. I think it's would like to thank again the invitation for FAO to be here. I think we are becoming closer to SEAFDEC in virtual events than in physical events, which is quite good. I'll say we have to look at the advantages also of virtual events. So I would like to thank you again for this invitation. And my presentation is going to be a little bit different in terms of trying to go back a little bit. Since we have a lot of people changing all the time in the negotiators, we are going to present a little bit why we are negotiating fisheries subsidies, the importance of it, and the FAO instruments. I think that would fit well into the flow of the morning today. So let me share my screen now. And so the idea here is basically to, first of all, that's a very traditional way of presenting fisheries from FAO, is to show the importance of fisheries in international trade. Because that's also one of the reasons why fisheries is taking a while to negotiate. And also I'm going to raise also some problems in terms of data, assessment of data and notification that also pose problems for this length of the negotiation process that we are facing. I hope that everybody is seeing my screen. About 2 months ago, FAO has released one of the major publication that we have in the fisheries division that compiles all the data on production, on trade, on the size of the fleet, on sustainability. And every year, this publication, in addition to releasing those information, it also had, we try to address an important topic on fisheries. And this, for the last one, we try to address the issue of sustainability. So that was the main topic of this publication. And that's why it's Sustainability in Action, the subtitle of the publication. We have it in 6 languages. So I really encourage, it's not a boring reading, I have to say that. It's very interesting to show the nuances of the production, trade, and even some challenges and problems that FAO faces in terms of data collection are reported here. So I think it's a very important publication to read. And when you look at the production in the last years, we see clearly in the last decade and more than that, a growth, the blue area here in this graph, is a significant growth in aquaculture production. We know that most probably aquaculture is not going to be involved in the new rules on fisheries subsidies. However, it's important to notice that aquaculture is becoming a major source of fish production. In fact, for human consumption, aquaculture already surpassed wild capture fisheries. And we are predicting that aquaculture is going to surpass in total, not only for human consumption, wild capture fisheries in 2022. So that's the forecast from FAO. And we also know the problems with the stocks at a global level. So if you see the orange area in this graph, you can easily see that, notice that the percentage of biological unsustainable stocks is increasing in the last years. That's a trend, that's a clear trend, and that's the global figure. Of course, we do have some distinctive figures at regional areas in FAO. So if you look at here, the percentage that is shown here is the percentage of unsustainable stocks. So they vary a lot in the globe, but on average, it's increasing in the last years. In this year, the publication that I mentioned to you, which is called SOFIA, we have some key messages. I'm not going to go each one here, but just to mention the importance of effective management. Because since sustainability is one of the key pillars of the negotiation of fisheries subsidies, it's important to notice that effective management is a key component of sustainability. It's not the only one, but it's a key component. And in addition to that, we are not saying that effective management, as complex as it should be for some countries, it's going to be applicable across the board. Of course, we do have the nuances of small-scale fishers and others that can apply already effective management system within their limitations. So it's very important that one size does not fit all here, but the importance is to produce as much as possible an effective management system. I have mentioned that one of the reasons, but not the only one, maybe even a minor one, but fish is a very important commodity in international terms. If we see this graph, which is quite significant, it compares the export of fish in comparison with other animal proteins in dollar terms, in value terms. So fish is equivalent to the sum of beef, pork, and poultry. So it's a very big market in international terms. And another very interesting fact is that in opposition to other animal proteins, fish is very inclusive of countries in international terms. This map was produced by the Dutch bank Rabobank, and it shows the flow of trade of seafood products. And it's interesting to know that even the largest producers of fish products are also big importers of fish products. Because we are not talking here about beef, poultry, or pork that you have a limited number of species. We are talking about products that have thousands of species involved. So even if a country is a big producer of fish products, it has to import other species that they do not produce. So this is a very important aspect too in the trade of fish and fish products. And here you have the main exporters and importers. So even we can see clearly here that even the big producers are also big importers, like Spain, like China, like Japan, Italy. So you see that this component is very important. You see clear here the China effect of importing the raw material and exporting some products that have been benefited. So China is a big share, it has a big share in both imports and exports. In exports, you have a big participation of Southeast Asian countries, Vietnam, Thailand. We all know the importance of some products in this area, and we're going to see later. And then we see the main groups of species that are exported. You see the predominance of salmon, but following closely by shrimps, cods, and tunas. Those are the big four main commodities that are exported in fish and fish products. And then starting to bridge a little bit in terms of the process of the negotiation in WTO, I would say that fisheries is quite unique for the WTO. We have to remember that WTO was born basically as an organization built from diplomats and economists and lawyers. And the notion of products built or products extracted from its own territory was a very implicit notion in WTO. So all the time, WTO created rules for oranges that was produced in a territory of a country, for cars, for iron, for ores. So it's a set of rules that was created for national products. So those are the traditional products. But if we think about fish, if we think about wild capture fish, in general, if we go for the area outside the territorial, the exclusive economic zone, there is no predetermination of origin for that fish. And that is a challenger for the negotiation process. One other issue that's quite unique in WTO is that for historical reasons, fish was not associated with agricultural products, as most of you know. It's associated with the industrial products. And in this regard, we already have an agreement that deals with subsidies from non-agricultural products. That's the agreement on subsidies and countervailing measures. But of course, this agreement is linked to the aspect that I have just mentioned about the territory of a product. This agreement tackles the product that has been produced or raised or extracted in a territory of a country. But it does not address properly the issue of products with no predetermined origin. And in addition to that, there is an angle in the case of fisheries that is not addressed at all in this agreement, and that has a direct link with sustainability, is that if there is any unfair practice in the high seas, for example, in trying to catch fish, that practice is going to affect, not at the first step, the trade of fish products, but it's going to affect the access to the product between the countries that are chasing the same stock. So in this regard, we create a distortion. The first distortion that is created in the access to the product. That's a very important angle. And this angle is particularly relevant to the environmental aspect of the negotiation process. And during this process that's becoming a very long process in WTO, we have some base concepts like IUU fishing, overfishing, overcapacity, special and differentiation treatment, and small-scale fisheries. These concepts, they have been present in several texts by the chair in more than one occasion. They have been present in ministerial decisions in WTO, and they have been present a lot in the discussion in plenary sessions. I'm going to elaborate a little bit the cross-links between those concepts and some of the FAO instruments that countries have already agreed in FAO, and that's the idea of this end of the section of my presentation. I'm not going to cite every single FAO fish instruments that we have. I'm going just to highlight the main three of them that have a very close connection with the current negotiation on fisheries subsidies at the WTO. This is a more extended list. We have the Code of Conduct. I'm going to elaborate that later. We have the IPOA, the International Plan of Action, on IUU and also on capacity. In fact, we have 4 IPOAs, but only 2 of them are relevant to the negotiation process directly. We have the Port State Measures Agreement. We have the voluntary guidelines for small-scale fishers, and we have the voluntary guidelines for catch documentation. So those are basically the main instruments that FAO has that can support countries in a better implementation of any future rules on fisheries subsidies. Of course, outside FAO, there is a very important instrument. That's the United Nations Convention of the Law of the Seas. And in particular, there is an article in that convention, which is Article 63, that deals with some basic principles. If 2 adjacent countries, 2 countries that are neighboring countries, they shared some stocks. And this article basically states that countries, they have to coordinate the issue of sustainability of shared stocks. It's not an option. It's a mandatory clause in the UNCLOS, and that's very important also for the negotiation process as a whole. In fact, coordination, not only for shared stock, not only for sustainability, is a very important aspect that impacts also many of the problems that FAO has in terms of reporting, for example, the status of the stocks around the globe. As I mentioned before, one of the main instruments that we have in terms of the linkages to the fisheries subsidies negotiations is the FAO Code of Conduct. It's, by coincidence, the FAO Code of Conduct was approved in the same year that WTO was created, 1995. And it's a very comprehensive instrument, the Code of Conduct. It goes from the pre-harvest to the post-harvest area. It encompasses everything: production, distribution, commercialization, overfishing, post-harvest issues. And it's a very interesting reading. It's a very short document. It's not only addressed to government, it's addressed to fish operators in general. And it was a very, I'll say it was a very creative document for 1995, because at that time, there is certification, for example, in fish and fish products was not very well known at that time. And the code already touched upon certification schemes. So it was a code ahead of its time. It's quite present reading. We encompass most of the main aspects applicable to fish and fishery products in this code. In addition to that, we have the port state measure, which is a newer agreement. It's a mandatory instrument, and for the first time, FAO has an instrument that clearly addresses the issue of avoiding a product of entering into a national market if there is some strong conditions, some strong assumptions that that product might be originated from IUU fishing. So for the first time, we can block a product at the port, at the border, and avoiding that product of being unloading in that country, because if there is a strong suspicion that that product might be coming from IUU fishing. And also we have the voluntary guidelines for small-scale fishers. This one, I'm going just to highlight one aspect, the aspect of one size does not fit all. And that's a very important message from the for the special and differential treatment in WTO, in fisheries. We have the problem, small-scale fishers, in opposition to other areas in the negotiations in WTO, small-scale fishers is a reality present not only in developing countries, but also in developed countries. So we have small-scale fishers in both areas. That's a completely different aspect in comparison with other negotiation areas in WTO. I mentioned to you at the beginning that map with the overfished stocks and the maximum sustainable yield, and a second one with the figures distributed around the globe. That map is built on what we call FAO major fishing areas. Although FAO collects data on a national basis, we do not release those figures at a national basis. We release those figures based on FAO fishing areas that encompasses several countries with, of course, coastal lines around that fishing area, but we do not release this data at a national level. And how we calculate that overfished stocks? How we calculate the state of the resources? We have several inputs that we receive. We receive inputs from national governments. We receive inputs from the academia, from the research institutes, and also we rely on publications. As I mentioned to you, in SOFIA this year, since the focus of SOFIA this year is sustainability, we have listed some of the problems that we have faced this year, in the last 2 years, because the publication is every 2 years, with the inputs of some countries not reporting data to us. And that's a critical aspect, because if we do not receive the data, the calculation is not so precise, because we have to rely more on third parties' inputs, and that decrease the trustness of the data itself. This is some numbers of the last information that we have. So we have the monitoring of around 70% of the world catch. We do have a publication that you can download with all FAO fishing areas and all the stocks in that area with the sustainability levels. Some big issues in terms of the WTO negotiations based on the FAO instruments that I have mentioned, but also in terms of generic terms. Notification is a very big problem for subsidies in general, and particularly for fisheries subsidies. Especially differential treatment. It has been already recognized in the mandate. It has been already recognized in the ministerial decision in Buenos Aires, and encompasses developing country, seeds, and small scale and artisanal. And then we have the issue that I have just mentioned before, the problem of data reporting to FAO. We have to have data, not only FAO, but WTO and other international organizations. Only with feasible data, it's going to be easier to negotiate and to implement an agreement. How FAO is helping the negotiation process in WTO? Basically, FAO, what we are doing is continuously trying to provide capacity building and technical assistance whenever needed in the areas that I have just mentioned. That FAO, we do have some experts on that. We are trying to provide more information using the indicator of the SDG 14.6, which is closely attached to fisheries subsidies too. We have been working very closely with other international organizations, WTO. Whenever the secretary requests, we have been present in Geneva. We have been closely working also with UNCTAD and with UN Environment, and that's more or less how FAO is supporting the negotiation process. In this regard, we also have implemented, together with UNCTAD and UN Environment, an interagency plan of action to support countries on the trade-related aspects of SDG 14.6. And this interagency plan of action has several areas that are in close contact with fisheries subsidies, and please email us if you need more details about this interagency plan of action. And finally, just to finalize, I would like to raise the issue of the importance of information on fish markets. Usually, we have a lot of gaps in information in general, particularly between developed and developing countries, but I originally came from agriculture before joining fisheries. And I was really surprised how fisheries, we have a huge gap, an even bigger gap if in comparison with other sectors. So I would say sharing information, sharing any kind of information is critical. It's critical for the negotiation process on fishery subsidies, but it's also critical for negotiating trade agreements, for having a better market access to other markets, and etc. So I just would like to highlight that FAO has a complete open area in a specific website with information on markets, information on fish commodities, information on trends, on trade flows, that we try to put together all the most available information on fisheries in a single place. And that's an idea to have more countries, more users, always using this tool. Thank you again. Thank you for the invitation. It was a great pleasure to be here again. Thank you.
Information. I think your information is not useful only those who are interested on issues of fishery subsidy, but also for the ordinary people who are just joining and would like to know the story of what kind of fishery subsidy and what kind of Southeast Asian countries may need to prepare. I think for not further ado, I think I would like to call John, if you are ready. Maybe we are. And for the attendee, if you would like to get more information on our resource speakers, could you please follow the link that I put into the chat box, because we have really limited time. And thank you, WTO, Mr. John, to join us today.
Well, thank you very much. I hope you can hear me. Can you hear me?
Yes, please.
Okay,
and
thank you.
Yes, John, please.
Okay, thanks. Thanks to the FAO, and thanks very much to SEAFDEC for inviting me to this webinar to give you some idea of the current process in the WTO negotiations on fisheries subsidies. Many of you probably know that the history of the negotiations goes back a long way. It goes back actually to 2001 and the launch of general negotiations, when there was a part in there about improving rules, and particularly the rules of, that is, the anti-dumping agreement, the subsidies agreement, and rules on fisheries. Now, that was a long time ago, and things have moved on quite a lot since then. And the emphasis on sustainability as part of the fish subsidy negotiations has only increased with time, as indeed has the need for some agreement to curb subsidies to fisheries. So particularly in more recent times, the biggest boost was definitely given by the Sustainable Development Goals. And you know Sustainable Development Goal 14.6, which tasks the WTO with getting an agreement on fishery subsidies that will eliminate subsidies that go to illegal, unreported and unregulated fishing, and prohibit certain subsidies that contribute to overcapacity and overfishing. And I've said that so often now, I don't even need to look at my notes to repeat it to you, because it is part of our mandate. It is repeated regularly by our members. And I've just given the core part of it, but added to that has to be said, the special and differential treatment is an integral part of the negotiations. So that was in the SDG 14.6. In 2017 then, in the WTO 11th Ministerial Conference in Buenos Aires, this mandate was essentially repeated, along with a call for members to make their notifications on subsidies, because as the FAO just noted, we do have a dearth of information on subsidies in WTO and indeed throughout the world in many areas, and not just fisheries. So that was part of the 11th Ministerial Conference declaration. And since then, the negotiations have certainly picked up a lot. They have become far more intensive, far more engaged, and quite recently, well, unfortunately, at the beginning, those negotiations were very much focused on trying to amalgamate the different proposals that had been made and put them into a single document, which it was hoped would become a basis for negotiation. Unfortunately, as we've often found in WTO, like Marzio, I'm actually from agriculture as well. So I do have a history in the agriculture negotiations in WTO. And where we found there, and we found again in fisheries, is that when delegations get the chance to add options, they add options. and more options and variations of options. And it just gets much more complicated than a usable document can be or should be. So this complicated document with all possible options is in the WTO. We call it 274 Rev 6, as is Rev 6. That tells you how many revisions it went through, 7 including its original. And it was an extremely complex document setting out every possible option for every possible rule in every possible permutation. It was not, unfortunately, really a very good basis for negotiations, and that was recognized by members generally. So after that document came out in early 2019 or late 2018, depending on how you want to count it, the focus really came to finding new ways around old problems, or finding alternatives. And one of the questions that, as an example, that keeps coming up is, say, artisanal fishing or small-scale fishing, and how do we treat it? There is no universal definition of these terms. There is no commonly accepted definition of these terms, and there's no internationally recognized definition of these terms. So in the absence of any international definition, how can we possibly deal with this sort of problem? Now, there are still proposals there saying that we must target large-scale industrial fishing, which offer definitions. But there's another idea of why don't we exclude it based on geographic zones? So we have an exclusion possibly to the territorial limit, maybe another exclusion for some groups to the extent of the exclusive economic zone. And this essentially would capture very small-scale fishing, which takes place close to shore. A small boat can't go onto the high seas for obvious reasons and can't stay out for very long because it's not very big and it can't carry much supplies. So some of these is just one of the examples of the ideas of ways around old problems that came out. And there were many others. Now, as a result of all this, the chair that we got, the new chair that we got who arrived, that's Ambassador Santiago Wills of Colombia. He arrived in November last year, replacing Ambassador Zapata of Mexico. He said that he was going to prepare a draft document. This is requested by ambassadors, by delegates, and he was going to present this and see if we could use it as a basis for negotiation. Now, one of the intractable problems that we've had up till now is particularly on overfishing and overcapacity, which is specifically part of the mandate. Under the overfishing overcapacity, we had several very different and apparently incompatible approaches being put forward. Some people would like a list. These subsidies are prohibited. Possibly along with that would be another list of these subsidies are permitted. You have another idea that no, everything is prohibited except this specific list that are permitted, and that list could be very long and essentially maybe even undermine the general prohibition on all subsidies to fishing. And then you have another idea of capping. So you can subsidize, but these types of subsidies, but only up to a limit. And that could be supplemented by specific prohibitions and so on and so forth, just to say that there are many different ideas out there and not all of them seem to be compatible. But what they all do share is something is not allowed. So the chair's idea was, why don't I just focus on the not allowed bit? I'll present something, see what you think of it, and if you like it, we can go ahead. Now, he did that earlier this year. Members, of course, they didn't like it because it's a compromise, and no compromise is liked by anybody, especially if you're the one that's compromising. But they could live with it, reluctantly. Not live with it as a rule, but live with it as something they can talk about. So that received let's say, it didn't receive a bad welcome, which is as good as you get in negotiations. So he presented that. It got its modest welcome. And using that, his idea was then that he would then go into intensive negotiations with the Director General, who, when we had a Director General back then, Roberto Azevedo, he would go into intensive negotiations with him co-chairing the meetings, and they would try to drive the process forward. Unfortunately, COVID intervened and everything came to a halt, sadly, especially for all the damage and suffering that it's caused. Never mind for our little negotiation. Instead of, now for a while, the chair put things on hold because of COVID because of problems communicating with people, because we were all pretty new to things like Zoom, which now works so well, but only a few months ago I didn't even know Zoom existed. So we have got used to these platforms, and as we've got used to them, what the chair has done is he had a discussion first in written procedure of a couple of proposals, and then he said, I'm going to present the complete document that I was working on. Well, not complete, but focusing on the subsidies to illegal fishing, subsidies for overfished stocks, and subsidies that contribute to overcapacity and overfishing. Focus on the three core disciplines. To do that, you need to know the scope and you need some definitions. So focusing on that, he presented this paper, he presented it to members on the 25th of June. That was just a presentation where he explained why he did this document and the way he did it. Then on 21st of July, we got first reactions to that paper. Those first reactions were, again, people didn't welcome it and say, oh, this is perfect, this is exactly where we should go, this is negotiation, but people were ready to work with it. And that is, I think, to me at least, in being in WTO over 20 years, that's a major step forward. Once you get people to talk about a single document with a limited number of choices in it, even if the choices are extreme, you've narrowed it down and now we can focus our work. And we saw this, that was on the 21st of July, that meeting when he got the first reactions. And last week, which is the first week after the summer holidays here in Geneva, we had a cluster of meetings. And during that cluster of meetings, members actually did engage on specific words, made specific suggestions. If you change this, if you move that, if you rephrase the other. And that is something I haven't really seen in fish so far, at least. Now, of course, you could ask the question, that's all very well and good, where do we go next? Well, hopefully we have to drive forward to an agreement. Our mandate, as you know, SDG 14.6 says an agreement by 2020. The WTO Ministerial Conference in Buenos Aires said in 2019 at the next Ministerial Conference. As we know, that next Ministerial Conference was supposed to have taken place this year, 2020, not 2019, in Kazakhstan, but it wasn't feasible to hold the meeting due to COVID-19. So we don't have a date for the next ministerial meeting. However, several delegations and ambassadors in Geneva have pointed out that our General Council, which meets pretty regularly and will be meeting before the end of this year, could make a decision instead of General Council. This has been done in the past, so there's no reason why it couldn't be done in the future. So General Council, as a legal question, can the WTO adopt a decision without a ministerial? The answer is yes. Are members prepared to do that? I don't know. That's up to them. But legally, it is a possibility. So we could reach agreement by the end of the year, and that's certainly what we are working towards. At the same time, as the chair has noted, and several countries have pointed out, COVID hasn't gone away, and they're still facing problems with internal communication, communication within groups in Geneva, communications with capitals, and great and all as Zoom is, it's still not a substitute for some people for face-to-face negotiation. So there are some who think that yes, the end of the year should be the target, but it's not going to be easy. Now, of course, on the other side, you could say that after 20 years, when exactly, how much longer can you possibly take? And why did it take 20 years? Well, coming from agriculture, I find that the difference with fish is quite surprising, shocking even. First of all, when I was involved in the Uruguay around agriculture, and even way back then, we knew we had more data than we needed. Whether the OECD had worked out its producer subsidy estimate for agriculture. We knew who the big subsidizers were. We knew about the distortions to world trade. We knew most of that kind of data. Now when I come to fish, we don't even know how many fish are caught. We don't know the extent of illegal fishing in the world. As for lots of reasons that have already been pointed out, fish travel around. They don't have passports. They go from one EEZ to the other or in and out of the high seas to the EEZ without asking the permission or carrying passports or any kind of tracking or tracing. So there are certain aspects of the fisheries sector which are very peculiar to fisheries alone. At the same time, it's a primary industry, true, but it's not necessarily an exhaustive industry. It's not a depletion industry like oil or minerals. You take the stuff out, it doesn't go back. Fish can come back. We just happen to be treating it like, instead of treating it like agriculture where we can harvest sustainably every year, we seem to be treating it like oil or gold where we can take it out and it never goes back in the soil. So there are differences, a very peculiar industry, true, but still the lack of data is quite surprising. Second one is the lack of common definitions. We all talk about artisanal, we talk about small scale, we talk about large scale, but there's no internationally agreed definition. And we've seen, we did a series of myself and my colleagues in the Secretariat last year, we did a series of regional seminars. And we saw in one country, their definition of artisanal was a boat with a motor and a cabin capable of staying at sea for up to 5 days. You then go to another part of the world and the definition of artisanal is a small rowboat. No sail, no motor, no freezing facilities, no nothing. And that's between two different corners of the world, of course, but it's just to highlight the differences in definitions that we have out there. So very poor data. There's lots of data. The trouble is the commonality among the methodologies. So we have FAO data on fish catch, which is very useful. It's all there is. So we've got to use it and it is very good. However, does it overestimate or underestimate? We see evidence from our own work that there is a major underestimation of fish catch in the FAO's work. No fault of the FAO, I don't need to blame anybody there, but it's just a fact, people underreport catch. But in some cases, people overreport catch. If you think there's going to be a quota introduced in your RFMO, well, you're going to overestimate catch, so you get a bigger quota just in case they do report it. And we've seen evidence of that. So data is dubious. And of course, illegal fishing, well, if it's illegal, you're not going to report it. So we don't know the size of it. And the only estimates are now quite old and vary from 10 to 20 something million tons, which is very big difference. So there are many reasons why fish take so long to negotiate. There's also, as was said, there's also this body of international law that's out there. There's UNCLOS itself, there's the Fish Stocks Agreement from the UN, and then on the FAO side, there's the PSMA and the guidelines and the plans of action, as we were just told. And we've got to try to make sure that our agreement matches them in terms of the words it uses, in terms of the phrases it uses, in terms of the definitions it uses. So if there is an international definition, we should use it, like there is for illegal and reported unregulated fishing. If there isn't, we probably shouldn't try to invent it, because if someone else hasn't done it, we're not likely to do it in the WTO. So we have to match that body of law. Now, having said that, if we're going to have an agreement on subsidies, as mandated by the SDGs and the Ministerial Conference, well, where else would it be except in the WTO? And because we do have a long history of subsidy information on industrial goods, on agriculture, we have a history of dispute settlement, and despite current problems with the dispute settlement process, it is still there and the rules are still there. And we also have agreements that don't deal directly with trade. We have the technical barriers to trade agreement. We have the sanitary phytosanitary measures agreement. We have the TRIPS agreement on intellectual property. So we do actually have some law and systems already in place that deal with issues that are not specifically about trade. And a lot of the questions that we keep coming up in fisheries about what do we do about fisheries management, etc. Well, there are parallels that we have, say, in the SPS agreement. What do we do about health? The WTO is not the WHO. The WTO doesn't deal with standards. It doesn't deal with what is the maximum residue level of a particular type of toxin in a particular type of food. There are other organizations responsible for that. Yet every country has rules to prevent the import of these products. It's on health grounds. Well, usually it should be on health grounds. Sometimes you do wonder. But in these cases, we do have the systems in place to allow for disputes to take place, to question whether or not a country's SPS measure actually matches the science or the recommendations of its scientific body. And we do have jurisprudence from panel and appellate body decisions where they did not get into the science, but they were able to find that the measure did not match the recommendation given by the scientific community. And there are several cases, EU hormones or Australia salmon and so on. So we have a history of taking into account non-trade information. We do have a history of controlling subsidies, and therefore the subsidies would seem to be a logical place for the negotiations, or it would seem to be a logical place for those negotiations to be in the WTO. A few words about the structure of the chair's text at the moment. Now, if anyone who's had the misfortune to actually have to read the text itself, you'll see that it's set out on traditional lines. It's got the IUU fishing and overfishing, overcapacity were highlighted in the mandate, so they are two sections of it. It also focuses on overfished stocks, which is a kind of an extreme example of overfishing, overcapacity. So although not in the mandate, it is very much part of our work, what we're supposed to be doing. As I said, to get there, it also needs some definitions. Because we're talking about wild marine capture fishing and sustainability, that is this mandate. It is based on, which is to apply to subsidies to wild marine capture. So it does not include aquaculture, does not include inland fishing. It's only wild marine capture. The definitions we use so far have all been taken from internationally agreed definitions where they exist, where they exist. Then that's the structure. What it doesn't have yet, or it has just as headlines, are things like boring stuff mostly, institutional arrangements. Is it going to be a committee or a subcommittee? Well, really, who cares? I mean, as long as there's a committee to oversee it, it doesn't matter if it's a committee or a subcommittee. It does some important things that are there yet to be put in are questions about territoriality, which are particularly important at sea. They're important on land, but they're very important on sea. It's not, well, maybe not very important on sea, but it's where you see most conflicts, most differences of opinion. This is my EEZ, no, it's my EEZ, and you get your differences. The idea here is being that the WTO shouldn't get involved. We do not do territoriality, thankfully. WTO is not a political organization. So we have the territoriality issue. There's also a question of disputes and remedies. If you want to take a dispute, what would be different about a fisheries dispute? And I already mentioned how we have the SPS agreement, and we have some differences there, how disputes get handled in SPS cases. Maybe fisheries should be different. What about remedies? If somebody is caught doing something illegal, what can you do about it? And there we have to look at remedies. Most important of all, which is in there at the moment, but only because it's an Indian proposal and it has to be reflected, is special and differential treatment. So though we have some details in there, much more work has to be done. So we have quite a lot of work to do, and we don't have a whole lot of time to do it. The chair has set out a process. We met last week. We're going to meet again in 2 weeks' time, in early October, twice in November, at the beginning and the end, and possibly in December as well. And we continue to work between all these sessions as well. So it's kind of continuous negotiation from here, at least until the end of the year. The chair is very committed to it, and so are members, and with luck and some productive and helpful engagement from our delegations, I think that we have a very good chance of making it by the end of the year. If not, we'll just continue into the new year and we'll get it done then. But what has to happen is by the end of the year, we have to be in a very good place, either very close to or actually at the point of a decision. So that was my brief introduction. I hope it was coherent, and I'd be happy to take any questions that you might have. Thank you.
Yes, thank you very much, John, for your information. What can I catch up from your presentation is that by the end of this year, all of members of WTO will have most likely close final text for over 20 years working on that issues. And I think the complexity of the issues in fisheries are not very simple that way. maybe we have to discuss among our ASEAN member states and SEAFDEC member countries on how to help our fisheries in the region. As already mentioned by FAO, we have a main player in exporting a number of fishery products in the global market. Okay, don't leave us for a while, and then we can come back at the final. Before the end of the day, we have the questions and answer discussion. Thank you, John, again. And I would like to go next. Madame Alice, we have two more. First is Mrs. Alice, and then we follow by the representative from Japan. Yes, the floor is yours, Alice.
Thank you very much indeed. Can everybody now see my screen? Yes, good. Well, a sincere thanks to the SEAFDEC Secretariat for the invitation to join, for the invitation to join this webinar this morning. For those of you who don't know what on earth IISD is, we're a non-governmental organization, a think tank that is based in Canada but has offices around the world, including in Geneva. And I work in the Geneva office, and we have been following the WTO Fisheries Subsidies negotiations very closely for the last few years. I've been asked this morning to talk a little bit about what some of the possible implementation steps could be for this agreement. And so I'll do my best, but of course the obvious first caveat is that the implementation steps are going to very much depend on what the shape of the final rules is, and also how those rules apply to different WTO members in different ways. But I'll go through just very briefly, as John's already outlined, what the key elements of the agreement might be, and for each of those key elements, what some possible implementation steps SEAFDEC member governments could think about. So as John said, we're focusing very much here in the agreement on subsidies to marine wild capture fishing and fishing related activities at sea. So we're not talking about rules that apply to subsidies to inland fishing or rules that apply to subsidies to aquaculture, just subsidies to marine wild capture fishing. And as John's explained, there are essentially three, as I think of them as kind of pillars of the negotiations, three key substantive rules we're talking about: the prohibition of subsidies to IUU fishing, the prohibition of subsidies to the fishing of overfished stocks, and lastly, this idea of a prohibition on subsidies that contribute to overcapacity and overfishing. And the idea there, as John's explained, is that we may have a qualitative kind of prohibition and maybe potentially quantitative limits on subsidies as well. So what I'm going to do here is to draw from a policy brief that we published earlier this year that looks at the potential implementation steps that countries, governments, members might need to think about, looking at where this agreement might end up. And this is speculative, admittedly. We haven't got the final rules yet, but we thought it would be helpful to give governments a sense, based on what we can see in the negotiations, of what they might need to start thinking about. So with all of those caveats in mind, bear in mind these are just ideas, considerations that you might want to reflect upon as government officials. So, I mean, speaking very generally, if we're talking about a treaty here that requires the notification and the reform of subsidies to fisheries, what are some very general implementation steps governments might want to start thinking about? And the first, of course, is to establish some kind of inventory of the subsidies that are provided in your jurisdiction. Those may be subsidies provided at the central level. They may be subsidies provided by regional governments. But the important point is to start to get a sense of what kinds of subsidies are actually out there. And this isn't always an easy task, right? If you have different levels of jurisdiction, you may need to actually start to gather information from a number of different government colleagues. This is going to be helpful for your eventual compliance with an agreement, irrespective of what the rules are. And it's also going to be very useful for submitting notifications under this new agreement. So WTO members are already required to notify subsidies under the existing agreement on subsidies and countervailing measures. And there are several proposals on the table here for additional notification of information about fisheries subsidies and, for example, about the fleets that benefit from those subsidies or the status of stocks that are fished with subsidies. So getting a sense of just what the state of play is in each of your jurisdictions may be helpful. Eventually, once we know what the rules precisely are and how they apply, governments will presumably need to assess where some of their subsidies programs might need reform and to start designing what those reform programs might look like. It's a key part of any subsidy reform program. This is something ISD has worked on a lot, is to make sure that the process for reform is adequately consulted with stakeholders, with the people who receive subsidies, who benefit from them, and that it's adequately communicated. And this is a key element of policy reform, but also of ensuring that any reform that's required has political support, without which it's going to be extremely difficult to get any reform done. So thinking about what you might need to do, and then how are you going to involve stakeholders in the reform process. Depending on exactly what subsidies are provided, there'll need to be some coordination between government departments, maybe between your trade department and your finance department and your fisheries department at a central level, maybe with regional authorities. Getting a sense of who needs to be engaged in these discussions is an important first step. And many governments will be developing country members of the WTO, and may be in a position either to provide assistance to others or to identify where they may need technical assistance to implement the agreement. And so getting a sense of what you're able to do on your own and what you may need bilateral or multilateral development assistance to do would be a useful first step as well. So these are sort of the steps that we would suggest governments might want to think about, almost irrespective of what's in the rules. But looking very generally, I mean, and as John has explained, the idea in the first pillar is that there may be a prohibition of subsidies to vessels or operators that are the subject of determinations of IUU fishing. So once there is a determination that a vessel or an operator has engaged in IUU fishing, that would then trigger the subsidizing government's obligation to stop subsidizing that particular vessel or operator. There are ideas also on the table that there might be exceptions under special and differential treatment to this rule. There may be exceptions to determinations made for fishing in the territorial sea, for example. That's an idea on the table. So exactly how this rule is going to apply and what it requires is to be determined, but that's the broad idea. So if that's sort of the broad idea, what are some potential possible implementation steps to think about? And the first, of course, is to think about how you might want to collect the details of vessels and operators that are caught making IUU infringements, and to work out what kind of a coordination mechanism you want to have between the fisheries management agency that makes the determinations, and if it's an internal decision between the fisheries management agency and your own finance ministry, or between your fisheries management agency and an international body, essentially perhaps to notify the determination in a way that puts other subsidizing members on notice that this vessel has been the subject of a determination. And for any WTO member, part of the implementation of this rule could involve reviewing whether your own sanction system and your subsidies legislation allows for the withdrawal of subsidies for vessels found to be infringing, whether those be national vessels and whether the determination is made by your own national government or by another government. So the idea here is to think about how you might want to link the decision of a determination, whether it's made by your own government or another, with the provision of subsidies to vessels or operators. So the focus really in the implementation here is about how you need to reform your subsidy rules, right? This is what's actually required for compliance. The agreement isn't going to require you to make an IUU determination. It isn't going to establish exactly how you must make this determination, apart perhaps from some basic due process steps. But the focus here really is on how you stop providing subsidies once a determination is made. So just to give you sort of an idea of the kind of technology that's out there that can help with this sort of implementation, many of you will already be familiar with Global Fishing Watch. This is a website that essentially uses satellite tracking and big data, artificial intelligence, to identify from automatic identification signals from large fishing vessels when and where they are fishing. This doesn't at all, and so essentially what this does is that it gives you, and this is all publicly available, but it gives you as authorities a sense of what is going on in your exclusive economic zone to the extent you don't have the information already, and it can give you a sense of where vessels flagged to your jurisdiction may be fishing. So this is not, you know, all this does is provide you with an amount of information. What would then need to come after that is an analysis of, well, is this fishing legal? If it is, absolutely fine, no problem. But if one of the concerns is, you know, how do we make sure we have a sense of what our vessels are doing? How do we make sure we have a sense of what's happening inside our EEZ? At least for large-scale fishing vessels, there is this sort of international, there is this sort of information available, and this is all free for the public to use. So that was sort of the first pillar, the idea of subsidies to IUU fishing. And the second one, as John's talked about, is this idea of prohibiting subsidies if a stock of fish is overfished. And at least as the text currently reads, the idea is that the prohibition applies if the stock is overfished and if it's continuously declining or not recovering. So the idea here is that the stock is not just overfished, but it's also not in a process of recovery. And there are, again, some exceptions that are also proposed to this rule. So you may be able to continue these subsidies if you can prove you have a management plan in place for the stock. And there are also proposals for special and differential treatment that might allow some developing countries to continue to provide these subsidies to fishing within their territorial sea, again, for example, and potentially with a longer transition period before the obligation applies. So again, if you're thinking about how you would want to link your subsidy policy to management decisions here, what sort of things might you need to think about? Well, how much do you know about the status of your stocks as currently fished? If you really don't have a very good sense of how of the status at the moment, you might want to think about how you can determine them using whatever method is appropriate. Now, those may be very resource-intensive stock assessments if you have the resources to do them, but you can also use data pool methods to get a sense of the status of your stocks, right? And the more data you have, the more precise and reliable and accurate the measure. But you can, scientists tell me, get a sense of the status of your stocks using data pool methods, right? So if you can start to think about how to get a sense of the status of your stocks, the next step, of course, as it was a bit with the IUU fishing subsidy prohibition, is to think about what coordinating mechanisms do you have in place between the agencies that are awarding subsidies and your scientific agencies who are using the best methods they have available to get a sense of the status of stocks. Again, the focus here is linking your subsidy decision with the information you have about the status of stocks. And then the last sort of administrative point, of course, is to think about, does your subsidy legislation allow for the withdrawal of subsidies from fleets that are fishing overfished stocks in particular circumstances? And you won't necessarily be able to draft that legislation now. It's going to depend on what the rule looks like, but at least thinking about what would need to change in your subsidy legislation to enable authorities to stop providing subsidies in the cases of a particular determination that a stock is overfished and that warrants the stopping of subsidies, or at least for a period of time. So that's sort of something to think about as you think about your own subsidy legislation. And you'll remember, I think, from the slides that Marcio showed, he showed you a map of different FAO fishing areas and the degree of overfished stocks in each one, or the degree of, as the FAO says, stocks that are fished beyond sustainable limits and stocks that are fished within sustainable limits. And at least sort of from memory, as I remember that, in some of the areas most relevant to some of the SEAFDEC members, we were looking at least as a proportion of assessed stocks, at somewhere between 20 and 30% of assessed stocks appeared to be fished beyond sustainable limits. So this rule, I think, is likely to be relevant to many SEAFDEC members, and it's worth sort of going back and looking at your data and thinking about what subsidies do we currently provide to which fisheries, what's the status of those fisheries, what might we need to change depending on the status of the final rule. And then lastly, this is a big slide with too much text on it, I apologize, but John was talking about the last big pillar of the negotiations, this idea of prohibiting subsidies that contribute to overcapacity and overfishing more generally. And as he explained, there's lots of different ideas in the Chair's draft consolidated text on this. And one of the ideas is that there might be a prohibition of subsidies to capital and operating costs, specifically those subsidies, when capacity or effort in a fishery is excessive. There's the idea of prohibiting subsidies to fishing in areas beyond national jurisdiction. There's a couple of different variations of what that might look like. There's the idea potentially of prohibiting subsidies to vessels that are reflagged, so flagged to another jurisdiction. And so those are the sort of what I call the qualitative rules. There's also the idea, and John mentioned this, about the possible quantitative limits on subsidies. Some members have proposed the idea of capping subsidies for some members and reducing them for some members while allowing other members to have, a default level or complete flexibility. And there's a lot of discussion, particularly in this pillar, about what degree of special and differential treatment would apply to developing country members. And that may be allowing exceptions for some of these rules to subsidies for fishing within a territorial sea, within a whole exclusive economic zone, and perhaps large exceptions for least developed country members. So there's different proposals on the table. And this is, I guess, one of the key uncertainties for many SEAFDEC members in thinking about what they might have to do, is that the degree to which these rules apply to each of you is going to very much depend on how broad or narrow the special and differential treatment in this pillar is. Notwithstanding, if you sort of wanted to be prepared and start thinking about what you might potentially have to do, if we're looking at the first rule, this idea of prohibiting subsidies that reduce capital and operating costs where effort or capacity is effective, you might want to start thinking about how you can establish or simply estimate, based on the best data you have, how much capacity and how much effort is currently being exerted by different fleets. You might have good data on this, you might not. But at least getting a sense of what you know and what kind of judgments can you draw is probably a useful first step. And then getting a sense of, is this capacity or effort too much? What information do we have about catch per unit of effort, for example? Do we already have some data that suggests there's overcapacity in this fishery, or that suggests there's too much effort? That would be a useful thing to start to understand. And then to think about, if you think there may be fisheries where this, where these conditions apply, how might you be able to redesign subsidies so that they're delivered in forms that don't reduce capital and operating costs, right? So remember, the idea here isn't all subsidies where these conditions apply, it's just no subsidies that reduced capital or operating costs, because those we know are the ones most likely to encourage overcapacity and overfishing. So if you think you have excess capacity or excess effort, and you think you're providing subsidies for capital and operating costs, the question is, can I provide this support in a different form? Can I provide it as income support? Maybe. Can I provide it as infrastructure, if that's what the fishery really needs more than a fuel subsidy? It's that sort of a question to start thinking about. And then there's the ideas of the idea of prohibiting subsidies that go to fishing in areas beyond national jurisdiction. And so the question to start thinking about there is, well, to what extent do I do this? To what extent do I already subsidize fishing in areas beyond national jurisdiction? And are any of my subsidies contingent on this fishing? This is this is the language in one of the proposals. To what extent do my subsidies, are they essentially contingent or tied to or provided almost entirely to fishing in areas outside my national waters? So that's one question to think about. The other sort of proposal in this idea is that rather than establish a contingency test to think about, the rule would be applied to subsidies to some geographical areas. So perhaps the other thing to start thinking about, in addition to the contingency question, is, do I provide any subsidies that go to fishing on the high seas but outside RFMO areas? In the SEAFDEC context, I'm not sure how relevant that is, because I suspect most of the maritime areas around SEAFDEC are covered by one RFMO or another. But then the question is, am I providing subsidies more generally to fishing outside my national jurisdiction? And just getting a sense of what the current situation is will help you to prepare for the rule as it is finally designed. And then the last question is really one that depends on what the status of the rules finally is, because if we end up with an agreement that establishes some quantitative limits on subsidies, it's going to be very important for the larger SEAFDEC members in particular to think about what their quantum is, right? How many subsidies, how much do they currently provide in subsidies per year, and how might that fit within the quantitative limits if those are established? And this is probably a point that's very difficult to get to at this point because the range of proposals on the quantitative limits are so wide. But that's one to kind of have in the back of your head, I think. And just to get a sense of, and I think both Marcio and John talked quite rightly about the fact that we have very little sort of hard notified data about global fisheries subsidies. What we do have is academic estimates, and I know these are contentious in some cases. They're designed to try and give us a very macro level sense of what is provided. So, I would take these sort of with a pinch of salt, but I think the one sort of really valuable thing to think about is if these estimates in terms of proportion are accurate, or at least are useful, what these estimates suggest to us is that a large proportion of subsidies are provided to large-scale fishing and a relatively small proportion are provided to small-scale fishing. If that's accurate, the point really to take from all of this is to think about the degree to which you provide subsidies to large-scale fishing and to small-scale fishing, even according to your own definitions, and to think about how the two reform pathways for those two broad kinds of fishing in your national context might look. You might need to do very different kinds of consultation for reform pathways for your large-scale fishers than you do for your small-scale fishers. So just something to think about in thinking about the patterns of subsidy provision. The very last thing to do is just to remind you that we have what I hope are some useful resources for you. We have a series of videos which walk you through some of the basic concepts, for those of you who aren't fisheries people, some of the basic concepts of the law of the sea, maritime areas, and capacity and fishing. If you'd like a refresher on that, we have a video on our website that walks you through it. We also have videos that walk you through each of the main areas in the negotiation and talk you through what some of the key decisions are. We updated those when the Chair's draft consolidated text came out in July with a state of play brief, which essentially walks you through again in an updated way based on what's in the draft consolidated text, what some of the key questions are and what some of the issues are. So if you'd like a sort of a one-stop 20-page summary of exactly where we're at, here's the link to it on our website. That's it. Thank you very much indeed, and I'll stop sharing my screen now.
Yes, thank you, Alice. I think you have provided our SEAFDEC members very good points that we are, what areas and what issues, topic that concern of our fisheries in the region. And I think our discussion tomorrow will very exciting when we will have a close session with the members on how to prepare such things, because as we heard from colleagues from FAO, we have a number of difficulties in estimating what stock conditions are and information, and here and there is not properly recorded, and even in some countries they are not have regular routine data collection in place. Very challenge in the future for us. Yes, last but not least, we have our country, one of the country very active in playing role in the WTO negotiation on fisheries subsidy. I think one of them, Japan, is one of our SEAFDEC members, and he will show us national views for today in the public and in the open session where we can have some more thoughts to think about tomorrow. Yes, the floor is your representative from Japan. Okay, please.
Hello everyone, my name is Katsumasa Miyachi, Fishery Agency of Japan. First of all, I'd like to express my sincere gratitude for taking this opportunity. Today, I'd like to briefly introduce Japan's proposal on WTO fisheries subsidy negotiation. Next slide, please. First, sorry. Next slide, please. First, I will introduce our mandate of WTO fisheries subsidies negotiation. And then I will introduce the focus issue of this presentation, introduction of Japan's proposals, fisheries subsidies and overcapacity and overfisheries, and our approach. Next slide, please. As previous speakers already introduced, the mandate of WTO fisheries subsidies negotiation comes from UN Sustainable Development Goals, SDGs. According to SDGs 14.6, by 2020, we should to prohibit certain forms of fisheries subsidies which contribute to overcapacity and overfishing, and eliminate subsidies that contribute to illegal, unreported, and unregulated fishing, IUU fishing, and refrain from introducing new such subsidies. Next slide, please. In this presentation, I skip subsidies regarding IUU fishing because IUUs are bad, and therefore there is general support to eliminate subsidies to IUU fishing. Rather, I'd like to focus on contentious overcapacity and overfishing issues. Next slide, please. Japan believes that subsidies in combination with proper resource management can avoid possible negative effect of subsidies on fish stocks. Japan also believes that the discipline of overcapacity and overfishing should be incentive for members to strengthen their resource management and ensure sustainability of fish stocks. Let's see the reasons from the next slide. Next slide, please. In our view, effect of subsidy upon fishery resources is greatly depend on the quality of resource management in place. Therefore, discipline of fisheries subsidies should take account of each member's fisheries management. As you can see, the interaction recipient and resource subsidy and resource management will greatly impact on stock status of fish. Next slide, please. Based on this recognition, Japan proposed that no harmful subsidies should not be subject to the overcapacity and overfishing, only if the conditionality and transparency are met. In this case, conditionality is recipients comply with the management measures based on members' proper fisheries management, and in transparency in this slide means information on fishers and their management, in addition to subsidies, should be included in notification and peer review. Next slide, please. The following no harmful subsidies should not be subject to the overcapacity and overfishing disciplines. First, implement international agreements on resource management. And second, ensure social welfare of fishers and maintain local communities depend on fisheries. And third, shift to more sustainable fisheries. Let's see in more detail at the next slide. Next slide, please. The example of no harmful subsidies, for example, reduction of small fish catch through improved fishing gear and equipment of vessel monitoring system, VMS, in the high seas, and enhancement of fishing labor safety on vessels, fishery-related support in remote islands, where aging is more rapid than the average rate in Japan, the commissioning of fishing vessels and transfer of fishermen to other fishers or non-fisheries sectors, and fish stock enhancement, such as the release of juveniles. Next slide, please. Regarding conditionality, the element of proper resource management are as follows. First, scientific stock assessment based on resource survey and fishing data. Second, legal institution for resource management, including fishing vessels registration and fishery permit system. And third, special conservation and management measures. And fourth, monitoring, control, and surveillance, MCS. And the exemption should only if recipient complies with conservation and management measures based on the government's proper resource management. In case of Japan, recipients are required to develop and implement their own resource management plans, such as time and area closure, restriction on catches and fishing gear, in line with guidelines established by the national and prefectural governments in order to be eligible to the such a subsidy program. Next slide, please. Japan proposed that each member provides the following information in order to enhance transparency, in addition to current subsidy notification and Article 25 of SCM agreement, such as subsidies exempted from the overcapacity and overfishing discipline, fishing activities concerned, and the relevant resource management. And Japan also proposed that a regular peer review mechanism should be set up in the WTO to enhance transparency of subsidies. And next slide, please. And there are many diplomats and trader experts but at the WTO negotiation, but a very few fisheries experts, even though fisheries subsidies are closely linked to the fisheries management, as I and the previous speaker explained. So we believe that your inclusiveness and participation are key to success of this negotiation. Good news is you can join the meeting through a video conference due to COVID-19 pandemic and travel restrictions. Therefore, I'd like to strongly encourage you to participate in the WTO meeting. Thank you for your kind attention.
Yes, thank you very much. Very exciting presentation from Japan. Thanks to your invitation to SEAFDEC for attending the WTO meeting. But however, I have to confirm with John. I don't think SEAFDEC has no possible invitation from WTO to attend, right?
don't know if you'd like me to answer that for you, but I will anyway. No, it's delegates of members only are invited, but it's up to each member to decide who is its delegate. So if the Japanese ministry were to decide that whoever should be one of their delegates, they are entitled to do that. But normally we'd expect it to be diplomats or people working in the ministries of fisheries or the Department of Fisheries and the Ministry of Agriculture or wherever the officials happen to be. Normally it would be government officials, but each country has the right to designate its own delegates.
Yes, thank you for your clarification. I think yes or no, SEAFDEC can join, but on behalf or under some arrangement with the countries, I think. Similar to other international fora, for example, IOTC, WCPMC, SEAFDEC sometimes attend as invited as observer by the countries. And I think I have one quick question to Marcio, our colleague. Thank you for always joining us. Last time he joined us IUU webinar, and before that he joined us the impact of COVID on agriculture and capture fisheries with SEAFDEC. Marcio, I would like to hear from you whether, as you mentioned, the concepts in the WTO negotiation on fisheries subsidy are including IUU fishing, overfishing and overcapacity, small-scale fisheries, and special and differential treatments. I think most of them are already technical assistance providing from FAO, but the area under special and differential treatment, and others, if you have, what kind of the role or technical assistance in order to address fishery subsidies in Southeast Asia? If you have any program or any plans or any idea how capacity of our ASEAN member states can be built or developed or improved in order to be prepared in the future. For example, stock assessment, we have very poor data. We have really limited resources, not only people, but also the knowledge, funding support, and whatsoever. Yes, Marcio, can you have any suggestion to us or any information to be provided?
Sure. I would say that in the area of involving small-scale fishers, which is a very strong reality for countries of SEAFDEC, we do have some capacity building actions focusing exactly on what you mentioned in terms of stock assessment, but stock assessment in a feasible way. You mean that, of course, there are problems of resource availability in terms of the treasury of national governments, and we are aware of that. And one of the areas that we focused a lot is to use simple tools for small-scale fishers to be able to implement practical and pragmatic results in terms of stock assessment. And that's possible. We have done that in some countries in Southeast Asia, also in some countries in the northern part of Africa. So it's something completely feasible. If there is any interest for any country to get more information about the program that FAO has in this area, just email me or email our regional office in Bangkok. So I think it's quite important because FAO, I would say it's like Alice know me. We have a lot of previous contact with WTO, and I'm not. In summary, I would say that FAO is more like a poor brother of the international organizations. So we are very conscious about the limitation of resources of countries in implementing any international measures. And that's why we always try to address those basic pillars like stock assessment in a very real approach to every country. And in the particular case of small-scale fishers, I would say that we have very simple solutions that can address that. So that's my overall comment about your question. Thank you.
Yes, thank you, Marcelo, for that clarifications. I think I strongly recommend all ASEAN member states and SEAFDEC member countries to have a look at the video series that Alice just mentioned about. I'm a big fan of your series of video. Very good knowledge I can obtain what kind of subsidies, and very good explanation how subsidies linking with the harmful and benefit, and those kind of information can be our member countries can learn from that video series. I would like to ask if Alice, you have any further. I'm sure that tomorrow our discussion will use your bullet points that you suggest to the floor today. Very useful for us to start discussion and how the country prepare for those kind of things that you recommended. Any further, after you hear from Japan, after you hear from the others, what kind of additional suggestion you may have, Alice? In addition to looking at a video series that you produce, any further recommendations? Because I think a lot of issues maybe tomorrow during the closed session we do.
Certainly, thank you. I'll be very brief. I'm really pleased the videos were useful. I should warn people though that I narrate all of them, so you'll get very bored of my voice. The other thing you might suggest, or that you might find useful perhaps in advance of tomorrow, is the state of play document, and the link is also in the chat here, because that updates a little bit the key decisions based on what's in the chair's draft consolidated text of July. So it takes the analysis just a bit further. I was just going to perhaps respond to the question about technical assistance, to say maybe sort of two things. And the first is building on the comment that Marcio made, that in fact there are a number of ways in which assessments of capacity and assessments of the status of stocks can be done based on relatively limited resources. Now, the more resources you have, the more precise your measurements will be, the more reliable they will be. Agreed. But nobody has an unlimited budget, and fisheries budgets are often particularly tight. So thank you, Marcio, for underlining that, because I think that's an important message. Perhaps one thing from my perspective is that, I mean, our sense, speaking to many fisheries experts, is that the way to think about this agreement is to think about how could you implement it based on the data that you currently have. And then to think about, okay, the better your data will be, the more effective this agreement and these systems will be at helping to make sure that your subsidy policies support sustainable fisheries rather than undermining them. But I think the important point is to think about, based on what you currently have, what could you do? How could you implement this? And then, of course, what assistance is available to help you focus on the subsidy reform part of it as a requirement for compliance with the agreement. And then separately, what assistance might you find useful to improve the status of, to improve your data and to improve the information you have, because that will make the agreement more effective for you. And the very last point to make is that, I mean, we at IISD are very conscious of the importance of this question. And we've been involved in quiet conversations behind the scenes at this point to help to encourage some of the multilateral and the bilateral donor governments to think about how their programs could be designed or could be reshaped to help developing country members implement this agreement. And so talking to some of the major bilateral donors and talking to organizations like the World Bank about the systems that they have in place, and are they thinking about the Fisheries Subsidies Agreement? And many of them are. So just to let you know that this is something that we are also very conscious of, and I'd welcome comments or contact from any of the SEAFDEC members about how you see the technical assistance needs and requirements, and what based on your own judgment you think would be most effective to help you implement the agreement. That's all, and thank you again for the invitation.
Yes, thank you, Alice, for your very kind words to our member countries. And I think as I informed earlier, we have a set of people in the chat group, the small room, for the panelists. I think number of them, they are in our panelist room. We have, I think the most active one today, she's not be able to attend according to my communication this morning with her. But we have a number of people here. The most senior one, I would like to invite the most senior of our SEAFDEC countries, Madam Lai Kim. I think you have been spend your time with fishery sector for long. Do you have any ideas or any questions to speakers that you have heard today? I offer my, okay, Madam Lai Kim, nice to see you.
Thank you, Mr. Moravit. Thank you, all of you, the speakers, for the very enlightening messages that you've given us, the presentations. For Singapore, our fishery is very small, but we are also very active. Mainly our Ministry of Trade and Industry is very active in the negotiations with our inputs. So even though the fisheries representatives may not be at the negotiating table, we provide we have very close communication and inputs. I think the issue for Southeast Asia is that we have a very diverse kind of fisheries, many species, and the bottom line underlying thing is we don't even know how much, we don't even know the health of our fisheries and our population, fish population in our oceans. So I think that is very fundamental. If you, it is very good to, I'm interested to learn what are the simple tools for us to understand and do a stock assessment without much resources. I think that's very interesting because it could be just by improving our data collection, how we analyze our data. So these are things that I think will be very useful for us in Southeast Asia and even for Singapore. Even though we have very small fisheries, we have very limited waters, but we really don't have much information and data about our resources. So I'm very interested in how to get my hands on this understanding of the simple tools to assess the stock assessment. Thank you.
Yes, thank you, Madam Lai Kim. All resource speakers, do you have any response? I think directly, involve, yes, Marcio, please.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Madam. It's, I think it was, I think that's important because one issue that during my presentation I mentioned briefly is the issue of cooperation between states. So regardless if you have a small fisheries or big fisheries in your country, it's important using the tools that are possible to implement at the national level to know the status of your fisheries, because that is going to have impact on other countries as well. So in terms of trying to come up with technical assistance, in terms of using the data to estimate status of the stocks and associated scientific issues, I'll just would like to stress again that FAO is entirely at the disposal of the Singapore government to support that. We can definitely work together in this regard in terms of settling a specific tailor-made stock assessment tool that can indeed provide more information, even if it's a small fishery or shared with other countries, because usually that's the case in SEAFDEC areas. Most of the fisheries are shared fisheries. So we can definitely work together on that. So I'm going to email you later on about that.
Yes, thank you, Marcio.
Thank you, Mr. Marcio.
I have one more person that I better invite him. He's the representative from SEAFDEC members the fishery sector are very huge and very valuable. Our Pak Duto, he also here, he is the representative from Indonesia. Pak Duto, if you're still in the room, can you open your video and share with us what kind of your thought after listening to a number of resources speakers today? I think very interesting. Pak Duto, I think you spend almost whole life dealing with information improvement. Yes, Pak Duto.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Dr. Warawit. So it's quite interesting to have knowledge on fishery subsidies under the WTO. But again, you know, as a typical of a big country, big small scale, the implementation is not really easy. We need the times. But since the presentation of Alice, there is some possible implementation. There's probably some ideas on do stepwise which fisheries that we are going to work with. That's the first one. And the second one, our national delegation for fisheries subsidies is under the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. And we still have we still don't have a similar platform or something like that. We still have some argumentation arguing on how the subsidies should be implemented. And the third one is definition on subsidies is not well established in the country as far as I know, but maybe because regulation it's one of the difficult part to develop, since we deal with the small scales. And again, there's also some political issues on subsidies. So anyway, overall, the presentation will be shared, right, Dr. Warawit? And the presentation will be shared to us before tomorrow. I miss your voice.
Okay, Pak Duto, for your information, by the end of today, we will send you our presentation. All the SEAFDEC members can see our presentations today.
Yeah, thank you. So maybe during one night, we are going to go more detail on all presentation and all the videos by Alice and all presentation by Marco. But let's see tomorrow, and we're going to discuss. But it's quite good to be involved with unsubsidized fisheries. But again, you know, the other side, we have to think the two situation between overcapacity and livelihood and other issues. So that's all my presentations, but it's quite good to be here, and thank you for the invitations, and hopefully the material will be shared soon, and then we have some topics to discuss tomorrow. Thank you, Dr. Wright.
Yes, thank you, Pak Duto, for your input. And I think tomorrow we have a very good time for discussing with our SEAFDEC members. Alice, do you have anything to clarify with Pak Duto?
Thank you, Dr. Warawit. I mean, nothing I think very specifically, but I think I was sort of very encouraged to hear Mr. Pak Duto sort of talk a little bit about kind of thinking through some of these implementation steps. You know, we know WTO members are pushing to have the agreement finished at the end of this year. But even if we hope it's finished by then, even if it takes a bit longer, it's going to be important for governments and for authorities just to start thinking through what this might involve, and to start understanding what data they currently have and where some gaps may be, and to just, you know, even to start meeting each other, right? I don't take it for granted that the people in the fisheries department know the people in the finance department all the time. So just starting to get a sense of coordination at this stage, and thinking through what the state of your fisheries are, what do you know, what do you not know, how much can you start to do already. I think all of that is extremely useful work to start at this point. And just the last point to make, if there's anything that you think an organization like ours can help with, and helping either SEAFDEC members collectively or individually to understand what's on the table and how the discussions are going, to link you to experts in subsidy reform. We know many of them, people who've thought for a long time about how subsidies can be reshaped. If that helps to provide input to some of your thinking, we're very happy to do that. So my email address is at the end of the slides, so you'll have them in addition to all the videos, and happy to provide any help we can. Thank you.
Thank you, Alice. And okay, I have one more country's representative. Of course, this country has very little marine capture productions, but they have a huge amount of inland products of fisheries. And I think Cambodia, Dr. Shamnan, if you have any message from you to us, maybe for further tomorrow or for the attendee today, that's useful for our thinking tomorrow.
Okay, thank you, SEAFDEC Secretariat, and thank you to all speakers that provide a lot of information for tomorrow's discussion. I think this is a very important platform also, giving the ASEAN member states to understand about the negotiation on rule for fishery subsidy. Actually, Cambodia is a WTO member. We actively participated in the negotiation on rule in Geneva. But some member of ASEAN, we are in classified in LDC group. So Cambodia, one of that group. And we can understand the difficulty for LDC with regard to scope and definition, and as provided by Marcio today on his presentation about the dimension of negotiation. And one of the most important with our fish stock, that more of the LDC member, we lack of capacity and data. That generally we are trying to seek for support, and then FAO will be the one that for the target for technical support, or And also thank for John provide a very good summary of the history background of the fishery subsidy negotiation. And we understand that it should be end by last year, the negotiation, but we could not, because a lot of elements that putting on us to discuss more detail. And concerning with the negotiation, I just raised some point, maybe it is important for ASEAN member to understand. Of course, John already mentioned about negotiation on the fishery subsidy, not include wild capture and aquaculture. And also from LDC group, we also propose not include freshwater. But more important on negotiation with regard to the marine, the fishing related activity, that is very difficult for negotiation, because as we understand under WTO umbrella, it is a member-driven approach. Then a lot of discussion, and we understand that each member have a different capacity, different national strategy, especially for the fishery management. That's why this is very important that we have SEAFDEC to support in this platform for ASEAN. And I hope tomorrow we will discuss more carefully. And today also I appreciate the Japanese proposal. We are very happy to hear your proposal by removing the IUU fishing in the negotiation, because IUU fishing is complex issue and very difficult. especially with the, for the LDC member, because the resource that we need to mobilize, this is very important. One another issue also, we understand the main goal for all members under the WTO is to achieve the Millennium Development Goal 14.6 that focus on to eliminate the overcapacity, overfishing. But in negotiation process, I personally wondering why we include overfish stuff in there and IUU. That's why I really happy to see the Japanese proposal to remove the IUU from the negotiation. Okay, I think that's all for Cambodia today. Thank you very much.
Yes, thank you, Dr. Samnan, for your information and that kind of observation. I would like to maybe just to confirm, would like to confirm with John. John, tomorrow, SEAFDEC member countries will have a very detailed and discussion on this matter. In case we have a number of clarifications to be made by the WTO, can I communicate to you later about if they have any questions or any clarifications that need to be made by the WTO with you by email? Is that okay with you, John?
Yeah, thanks. Of course, I'd be delighted to answer any questions that you have, but I would be careful. Asking the WTO Secretariat a question doesn't always get the answer you want to hear. We have to be very careful what we say and how we reply. We don't want to offend anybody. We're very nice people. But to the extent that I can, I'll answer the question as straightforwardly as I possibly can. But obviously, I'm not going to give an opinion. You can't ask me what do I think of the US proposal or Japan's proposal. I will just say it's a very nice proposal, that's all. But if you want to know anything about details about the process, the procedure, etc., be delighted to help you. Thank you.
Yes, thank you, John. I think we will screen whatsoever we want to send to you first. Don't worry. We don't ask you what do you think about Alice's video series? Okay. Yes, I think I would like to hear from Japan after you present to us the number of issues and proposals that to be submitted to the WTO. Any further message that you want to talk to our resource speakers here? Or? Yes, please.
So thank you. Just let me correct my statement that my presentation focus on overcapacity and overfishing issues, but we don't propose anything about IUU. So that's
IUU or English no problem.
Sorry. We don't oppose to eliminating IUU fishing. That's all.
Thank you, Japan.
Thank you.
Yes. Okay. I think before we end our session today, thanks a lot to everyone. I think last but not least, I would like to invite our Secretary General to give you the speech, short speech before ending the session today. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Warwick. Good afternoon for all. I am very concerned when I listen to all the speaker about the condition of the Southeast Asian, especially for the nature of our fisheries that we have multi-species stock. And then when it's come to the assessment, it's quite hard. So I think that maybe we need to ask assistance technically from all of you again soon. And like Dr. Wari said, after the closed session meeting tomorrow, maybe we have more clarification and maybe more common statement to make. And then we will contact you very soon. But for now, thank you so much for your time. And we are very happy and gain a lot of knowledge and information. So thank you so much. Have a good day.
Yes, thank you everyone, and see you again, SEAFDEC member countries tomorrow. Thank you everyone. Thank you. ขอบคุณครับ Bye bye. Thank you. See you next time.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you, Alice.